My mom fired me from our family restaurant. You're embarrassing us in front of real chefs, she shouted. 6 months later, a Michelin critic tried my food and called me a culinary genius on live TV. You never took me seriously, Mom. She leaned back in the small wooden chair across from me, hands folded, eyes hard. Because you were being reckless, Saul. You were experimenting when you should have been following the rules. I laughed quietly, not out of humor, but frustration. The rules? The ones that nearly sank your own restaurant? My name's Saul Delacruz, 33, born and raised in Monterey, California. And if you've ever worked in a family-run restaurant, then you probably already know, blood and business don't always mix well. My story isn't just about a job. It's about pride, identity, and a complicated, messy relationship with the woman who raised me, mentored me, and eventually, pushed me out of the only place I'd ever known as home. My family runs a small restaurant in the heart of Monterey called Casa Verde. It's been around for nearly 4 decades. It was my grandfather's dream, passed to my mom when he passed away in his late 60s. She kept it going with an iron will and a stubborn grip on every aspect of the business. Casa Verde has always had a loyal following, locals who wanted hearty, rustic Spanish food, the same way it was served in the 80s. My mom never strayed from tradition. Ever. From as early as I can remember, I was in that kitchen. My school breaks were spent peeling potatoes, rinsing vegetables, and wiping down prep stations. I got good at it. Not just the grunt work, but the art of food. I watched documentaries, read chef memoirs, and studied cuisines outside of our family's comfort zone. But any time I mentioned trying something new, like updating a dish or sourcing different ingredients, my mom would shut it down immediately. You're not a chef, she'd say, slicing garlic without looking up. Your family. I heard that line so often, it became a kind of curse. And the thing is, I was a chef. Not a famous one, not a titled one. But I had ideas, and passion, and I spent every ounce of my free time experimenting with new flavors, techniques, even plating styles. Still, my mother believed in hierarchy, and I was at the bottom of hers. Then one day, that hierarchy cracked. We had a wedding party booked, 12 guests, one of whom was a local artist my mom adored. It was the kind of crowd that could elevate the restaurant's reputation. So I spent days planning a dish just for them. A reimagined paella, fresh Dungeness crab, saffron butter reduction, and grilled lemon instead of traditional wedges. I used local Chardonnay in the broth and garnished it with microgreens from the farmer's market. It was bold. It was beautiful. It was the best thing I'd ever made. She stormed into the kitchen just as I was plating. One look and her face hardened. What the hell is this? It's paella. I added a twist, like we talked about. Her voice went cold. This isn't our paella. You're making a mockery of our food. I tried to explain. I mentioned the compliments I'd gotten from customers on earlier specials. But she wasn't listening. You're embarrassing us, she said, loud enough for the entire kitchen to hear. In front of real chefs. Get out. I thought she was joking at first. When she crossed her arms and glared at me like I was a stranger, I knew she meant it. I was stunned. I took off my apron and walked out the back door. That was the last time I stepped foot in Casa Verde, for a while, at least. I bounced around for a bit. Stayed with a friend in Salinas who ran a taco truck and let me sleep on his couch. I helped him prep in the mornings, and in exchange, I had a roof and some hot meals. But I knew I couldn't keep hiding in someone else's shadow. I'd been fired from my own family's kitchen, humiliated, discarded. But I still believed in what I could do. So I took a huge risk. I found this tiny, barely functional food shack near Cannery Row that used to serve crepes. The lease was cheap, the interior was a mess, and the old fryer looked like it had seen the Reagan administration. But I had saved just enough for a deposit and a coat of paint. I called it bruma, Spanish for sea mist. It reminded me of the fog that rolled in every morning off the coast, and the feeling of uncertainty that followed me every day. I made a tiny menu, just 5 items. Seasonal, simple, honest food. I used ingredients from local farms and fish markets, things I could walk or bike to get myself. Every dish was a variation of something I'd dreamed about making for years. I had no staff, just me and a tiny kitchen the size of a janitor's closet. The first few weeks were hard. No advertising, barely any customers. A couple tourists, a few locals who looked confused by the minimalist menu. I made a few dollars a day, and sometimes, I didn't make anything at all. But I kept going. Then something changed. One afternoon, a food blogger from Santa Cruz happened to wander in. She ordered the duck confit with blood orange glaze and took photos with her phone. That night, she posted a glowing review. This guy's cooking out of a shack, but it tastes like fine dining in Paris. The next day, the line was out the door. People came because of her post, but they stayed for the food. The local paper wrote about me. The Yelp reviews were ridiculous. And then, 6 months after I was fired, a man walked in wearing sunglasses and an understated linen shirt. He didn't say much, just ordered the whole menu. I didn't know who he was until 2 days later. Turns out he was Cedric Laurier, a critic who consulted for Michelin on the West Coast. I found out because he went on a local food program and dropped my name like it was common knowledge. "There's this guy in Monterey," he said. "He's cooking in a former crepe shack, and he might just be the most exciting new voice in California cuisine." I played that clip so many times, I probably wore out my phone speaker. A week later, I got a text from Hugo, my brother, who had since become a lawyer in San Diego. "Mom saw the interview. She didn't say much. But I think you should expect a visit." And sure enough, she came. Unannounced. Dressed in the same navy blazer she wore to wine tastings and city council fundraisers. She stood in line with the rest of the customers, didn't demand special treatment, didn't even ask for me right away. When I finally approached her table, she looked at me like someone she hadn't seen in years. "You were always talented," she said simply. That was her way of apologizing. Not direct. Not emotional. Just enough to acknowledge the truth she had once refused to see. We talked a little. About Casa Verde, about how business had slowed, how the regulars were aging and the new generation didn't care about traditional menus. Then she said something that nearly made me drop the tray I was carrying. "Maybe you could help. Freshen it up?" I didn't say yes. Not yet. I told her I needed time. Because what she was asking wasn't just about food. It was about trust. Respect. Something I had to earn not just for myself, but demand from her, after all these years of being treated like a helper instead of a partner. But part of me wanted to help. Part of me still loved that little restaurant where I learned to tie my first apron. I told her I'd think about it. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, she's come back twice. Each time, she's been polite, quieter than I ever remember her being. She doesn't criticize the menu or pick apart the garnishing like she used to. She just eats. Once, she even brought one of her old friends, a retired chef named Marlene who used to work with my grandfather in the early days of Casa Verde. That meant something, at least, I think it did. But the decision wasn't easy. Bruma was thriving in ways I never expected. I had 2 part-time cooks now and a pastry chef named Kair who made these rosemary shortbread cookies that people raved about. I was no longer cooking to survive, I was cooking because people actually cared. They lined up for my food. Not my grandfather's, not my mom's, mine. The idea of going back into Casa Verde felt heavy. Like walking into a room that still smelled like a version of myself I didn't want to be anymore. The chipped tiles, the yellowing menu, the framed photos on the wall that froze my grandfather in his glory days, it all felt like a museum, not a living kitchen. But there was another part of me, maybe the same stubborn streak I got from her, that felt like I couldn't just turn my back on it. Not completely. Not now, when she was finally asking instead of commanding. I started driving past the place at night after closing up at Bruma. I'd park across the street and just stare at the front windows. Sometimes the lights were still on. I imagined her inside, sitting at the bar alone, thinking about what to do next. The last few years hadn't been easy for her. The pandemic nearly sank the restaurant. A few longtime staffers had retired or moved away. Hugo told me she'd taken out a second mortgage just to stay afloat. And here I was, barely a mile away, running a place that was bursting with customers and momentum. The guilt was strange. I knew I didn't owe her anything, not really. She fired me. She humiliated me. But she also raised me, taught me everything she knew, even if it came wrapped in criticism and hard lessons. A week after her second visit, she left me a voicemail. She never does that. Saul. It's me. I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you. Whatever you decide about Casa Verde, it's okay. But I miss working with you. I think your grandfather would have been proud too. That message sat in my phone for days. I listened to it more times than I should admit. Her voice sounded small. Not defeated, but not invincible either. For the first time in my life, I heard uncertainty in her tone. She was reaching out. Still, I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on Bruma. We were expanding the menu again, adding a few dinner entrees and testing out some tapas-style lunch offerings. I'd been invited to a food expo in San Francisco to do a tasting demo. Everything was moving fast, and I was barely keeping up. But she stayed on my mind. One afternoon, during a slower hour, I found myself looking through some old photos on my phone. I came across a blurry shot of me at 16, standing at the pass window in Casa Verde, my hair too long and my face greasy with sweat. My mom was next to me, arms crossed, looking stern, but there was a ghost of a smile on her face. That was one of the only photos I had of the two of us in the kitchen. That night, I sent her a text. Want to talk about menu ideas? No promises. Just a conversation. She responded in under 2 minutes. I'll brew some chamomile. Tomorrow? When I walked into Casa Verde the next day, it felt like stepping into a memory I wasn't sure I still belonged to. The place hadn't changed much, same dark wood paneling, same framed newspaper clippings, same scent of smoked paprika and thyme lingering in the air. She was at the bar, 2 mugs in front of her, steam curling in the air. We didn't talk much at first. She slid a notebook toward me. Inside were sketches, her handwriting, but softer, more open. She'd written down ideas. Actual changes. Seasonal sides. A few fusion suggestions. One even had a note, inspired by Saul's seafood paella. It caught me off guard. I flipped through the pages, pretending to study them, but mostly just processing the fact that she had made space for me, for my ideas, in her own neat handwriting. I know I messed up, she said finally. I was afraid of losing the restaurant. I thought if I let you change things, we'd lose what made it ours. I didn't respond right away. Eventually, I said, maybe it needs to become something new to survive. She nodded, slowly. That's what I'm hoping for. We spent the next hour tossing around ideas. I didn't commit to anything, but I left with the notebook in my hand and the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, this relationship wasn't beyond repair. Back at Bruma, I stayed late that night. I watched the line outside dwindle. I sat alone at one of the outdoor tables, the sea breeze cool against my skin. I thought about what it would mean to go back. Not to move in, not to give up Bruma, but to collaborate, to help her pivot. It wasn't about rescuing her. She was still fierce, still sharp. But maybe she finally saw me as more than the kid at her heels with wild ideas. That week, I found myself straddling 2 kitchens, 2 identities. At Bruma, I was the visionary, the final word on every dish. But at Casa Verde, I was still Saul, her son, walking carefully through a space that held both good memories and deep resentment. I started coming in on Mondays, her slowest day. Not to work, exactly, but to sit with her and go over ideas. We'd taste sauces together, Debate over plating techniques, argue about whether ceviche needed avocado. She said no, I said hell yes, and then somehow always landed in a place of mutual curiosity. It was the closest thing we'd had to collaboration in our lives. I'd forgotten how sharp she was. Celia didn't need a recipe book, she worked by memory and instinct. Her flavors were honest, sometimes simple, but always rooted in something real. That's what I had rebelled against, her unwillingness to evolve, but now I saw it from a different angle. She wasn't afraid of new ideas, she was afraid of losing the essence. The lineage. One afternoon, while testing out a roasted lamb shoulder in her kitchen, I said, "You ever think about what Grandpa would have said?" She didn't look up, just kept basting the lamb. "He wouldn't have approved," she said, "at first. But he would have come around." That hit me harder than I expected. We worked in relative peace for a few weeks. Customers were starting to notice some subtle changes, more seasonal produce, brighter flavors, smaller but more elegant plating. Reviews on Yelp and TripAdvisor turned more positive. Locals who had stopped coming in began returning. One evening, a couple said, "It's still Casa Verde, but it feels new. Fresh." Celia didn't smile at that, not in front of them. But after they left, she murmured, "That's your touch." We didn't talk about the past often, but there were moments where it leaked in. One night, we were closing up. I was wiping down counters when she said, "You know, when I fired you, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it would scare you straight." I didn't say anything. She went on, her voice lower now. "But you weren't a kid anymore. And I treated you like one. I was wrong." That was as close to an apology as I was going to get. But honestly, it was enough. I nodded, still scrubbing. "Yeah. You were." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was real. Like something old had cracked open, and air was finally getting in. Still, as much as things were improving, the gap between us hadn't fully closed. There were moments when she still snapped, still questioned decisions I made or got cold when I didn't agree with her. That part of her wasn't going away. And I was still learning how to hold my ground without defaulting to that old kid in the kitchen version of myself. Meanwhile, Bruma was gaining steam. A Los Angeles-based food magazine had reached out to do a feature. We were being considered for a local food and wine event in Carmel. Investors had started sending inquiries, people who wanted to take the brand into Santa Barbara, or even the Bay Area. And with all of that momentum came pressure. Kaoru pulled me aside one day and said, "You're splitting yourself. Something's going to give. Either this place suffers, or you do." She wasn't wrong. Every hour I spent at Casa Verde felt meaningful, but also like time I was stealing from Bruma. My team was capable, but they needed me, not just for the food, but for the vision. And deep down, I knew that being in two places long-term wasn't sustainable. Something had to shift. But how do you tell your mother, who's finally seeing you, finally trusting you, that maybe you can't save her restaurant after all? Or worse, that maybe she has to learn how to save it without you? I wasn't ready to answer that question yet. And things took a strange turn before I had the chance. Late one Thursday night, I got a call from Hugo. I hadn't heard from him in over a week. "Hey, you free?" he asked. "Depends. What's going on?" He hesitated. "It's Mom. She got into it with Ramon." He walked. Ramon had been the sous chef at Casa Verde for 20 years. He'd seen 3 generations of Dela Cruz tempers and still somehow kept the kitchen from falling apart. "She fired him?" I asked. "Not exactly. She accused him of tampering with the inventory records. He said she was being paranoid. Things escalated." I sighed. "What do you want me to do?" "I don't know, man. Just talk to her?" I didn't answer right away. Because I knew what this meant. She was spiraling again, defaulting to control when things felt unstable. It wasn't new. But this time, it wasn't just hurting her, it was hurting the people who had stayed loyal, even when she hadn't deserved it. The next morning, I showed up at Casa Verde unannounced. She was in the back, furiously organizing the dry storage shelves, muttering to herself. "Where's Ramon?" I asked. She didn't look up. "He quit." I waited. "He didn't quit, Mom. You pushed him out." She slammed a can of chickpeas onto the shelf. "I trusted him." "You trust no one." That stopped her. She turned slowly, eyes tired but sharp. "That's not true." "Yes, it is," I said. "You want control because you're afraid of losing everything. But you're losing it anyway. One piece at a time." We stood there for a long time in silence. The clatter of pots in the kitchen behind us, the low hum of prep music from a speaker by the dish pit. Then, finally, she said, "I don't know how to do this without him." Without. All of it the old way. I didn't say anything. I just stood next to her, reached for the shelf, and started helping her restack the cans. Because sometimes, love doesn't look like a heart-to-heart or an apology. Sometimes, it looks like reorganizing dry goods with someone who's finally admitting they can't do it alone. But even as I helped her, a thought crept in I couldn't shake. If I stayed, I might lose what I'd built. And if I left, she might lose what little stability she had left. The choice was coming. I could feel it. A conversation I didn't want to have. And I had no idea which version of me was going to win, her son, or my own man. That night, I barely slept. I kept cycling through everything. Bruma. Casa Verde. My mom. My team. Myself. I felt like a thread being pulled from both ends, and the knot in the middle was about to snap. Around 3 a.m., I sat on the balcony of my tiny apartment above the bakery on Foam Street. The fog had rolled in thick, covering the street lamps and softening the usual city noise. From that spot, if I leaned forward just enough, I could see the faint glow of the Bruma sign across the plaza. It was off, of course, Keiru had closed up earlier, but even in darkness, it felt alive. Like it had a heartbeat of its own. Bruma was my future. It was my name, my vision, my growth. But Casa Verde? That was history. That was blood. That was my mother, trying, clumsily, awkwardly, but genuinely, to reach for something different. And I knew I couldn't stretch forever. The next morning, I got to Bruma early. Too early. The kitchen lights buzzed when I flipped them on, and I stood there alone for a while, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaks of the building settling. Keiru came in an hour later, tossing her keys in the usual dish by the coffee maker. "You look like you haven't slept," she said without even looking at me. I didn't. "Did she call again?" "No," I said. "It's not about a call. It's about what comes next." She turned to face me, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Her voice was flat. Not angry. Not sad. Just matter of fact. I shook my head. "No. I'm not leaving. But I don't think I can keep doing both." She didn't say anything. Just nodded. "I might help consult on her place," I added quickly. "Just until she finds someone else, or gets comfortable making changes without me." Keiru raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure she'll ever let go?" That was the question, wasn't it? Because even though she'd invited me back, even though she'd softened a little, Celia Dela Cruz didn't let go. She adapted, maybe. She evolved, slowly and under protest. But she didn't step aside. And maybe she wasn't asking me to step in as an equal, maybe she was just trying to pull me back into orbit. And yet. A week later, I agreed to co-create a new seasonal menu for Casa Verde. Just a test run. A few months. Nothing permanent. We agreed that I'd come in 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. I'd oversee the prep, help the new hires, bring in some vendors I trusted. It wasn't a takeover. It was a collaboration. At least, that was the plan. The first few weeks went smoother than I expected. She gave me space. She didn't question my suppliers. She even allowed me to rework some of the sauces for the tapas menu, which was nothing short of a miracle. One night, she even sent out my grilled eggplant and romesco crostini to a group of VIPs and told them I was the one who created it. That moment meant more than I could admit out loud. But the old tension was never far. Some days, it was subtle, just a quiet sigh when I swapped out her beloved anchovy paste for fresh-cured bacquarons. Other times, it was sharper. Like the night she redid a plating I'd trained the new line cook on right in front of him, undermining everything we'd discussed. I pulled her aside afterward. "Mom, if we're going to do this together, I need you to let go a little." She folded her arms. Let go of what? Of control. Of the way it's always been. I'm not here to be your assistant. You asked me to help. That only works if you let me help. She didn't argue. Not exactly. But the air between us went cold. And still, I kept showing up. Meanwhile, Bruma was booming. The article in the LA food magazine dropped, and with it came a surge of reservations. We were booked 2 months out. A small film crew wanted to feature us in a docuseries on up-and-coming West Coast chefs. I was invited to a panel in San Francisco, and a pop-up in Portland. Every win at Bruma felt like validation. Proof that my instincts were right. That I could build something from nothing. That I wasn't just some stubborn kid with wild ideas. But with each win, the pressure mounted. And with each moment I spent at Casa Verde, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. Or if I was just delaying the inevitable. One evening, after we finished service, Celia and I sat outside the back door on milk crates, just like we used to. She offered me a cigarette, even though I'd quit years ago. It was more symbolic than anything. "Are you thinking of leaving?" she asked, eyes fixed on the parking lot. I paused. "I'm not sure I ever really came back." She nodded. "I don't want to hold you back, Saul." "You're not." She gave me a sharp look. "Well. You were," I said, softening. "But not anymore. You asked for help, and you're letting me help. That's more than I ever thought I'd get." She didn't respond for a while. The night air wrapped around us, heavy with salt and kitchen grease. "You always wanted more than this little restaurant," she said finally. I shook my head. I didn't want more. I just wanted it to grow with me. That landed differently. And for once, I think she understood. But understanding doesn't always mean agreement. The next few weeks would test everything: our partnership, our boundaries, even my ability to stay focused on what I'd built at Bruma. Because while we were making strides at Casa Verde, I could feel something brewing. Pressure. Expectations. And the creeping sense that at some point, I'd have to make a real decision. I didn't know when the final straw would come, but I felt it building. A slow, creeping tide of exhaustion, disappointment, and quiet frustration. It wasn't one thing that set it off. It never is. It was dozens of small things: the way Celia would change the menu behind my back when she felt uncertain, the way she'd suggest something to a server that directly contradicted my instructions, the passive-aggressive comments about how the old regulars didn't care about modern nonsense. I'd given her everything I could: my time, my creativity, my patience. But she hadn't changed. Not really. Not deep down. The surface was calmer, but the roots of control still ran deep. And I knew I couldn't live in 2 kitchens anymore. I still remember the moment clearly. It was a Saturday. Bruma was slammed, full patio, people waiting with wine glasses in hand, an energy that buzzed like electricity. Meanwhile, I got a frantic call from Casa Verde. One of the new line cooks walked out after a blow-up with Celia. I left Kaoru in charge and drove over, still in my Bruma apron. Celia was in the back, barking orders and practically foaming at the mouth. The kitchen staff looked exhausted, like they'd been trapped in a pressure cooker for hours. I pulled her into the walk-in fridge and shut the door behind us. Enough, I said. What are you talking about? You don't want help. You want obedience. She blinked. I've let you, no. You tolerated me. That's different. You want things your way, even when your way is sinking the ship. She folded her arms, defensive but quiet. I'm done, I said simply. No more menu consultations. No more Tuesday prep. No more band-aids. You either take the tools I gave you and run with them, or let it rot. I left her there in the cold, surrounded by cases of citrus and tubs of romesco sauce. And I didn't look back. Back at Bruma, I was welcomed like I'd just returned from war. Kaoru handed me a glass of white wine and said, about time. I was fully present again. And the timing couldn't have been better. 3 weeks later, Cedric Laurier, the same Michelin-affiliated critic who had first discovered Bruma, returned for another surprise visit. Only this time, he wasn't alone. He brought with him a camera crew from a French-Japanese streaming food show that was launching in the US. The theme? Innovators of the Coast. And I was going to be in the pilot episode. Filming began the next week. They shot B-roll of the markets I shopped at, my prep techniques, my team working in quiet synchrony. They asked about my inspirations, and yes, they asked about Casa Verde. I didn't lie. I didn't trash my mom either. I simply said, I started there. I grew up in that kitchen. But I wanted something different, something that reflected who I am now. And Bruma is that. The episode aired a month later. Celia saw it, of course. She didn't call. She didn't text. But she didn't need to. Because a few days after the episode dropped, something poetic happened. Bruma's waitlist hit 3 months. Food influencers and journalists from all over California started arriving in droves. I was invited to collaborate on a tasting menu in Napa. And, best of all? Casa Verde? She lost her head chef, again. The replacement I had briefly trained left to start a food truck with one of my former line cooks. They called it Verde Nuevo. It was sleek. Young. Inventive. Word on the street? It was what Casa Verde used to be, but with flavor. My mom tried to sue them for the name. She failed. Turns out, the Dela Cruz name didn't mean much anymore in the food scene. Bruma did. Still, I never gloated. I never rubbed it in. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's soft. Sometimes, it's you standing in your own kitchen, plating a dish for a celebrity who just flew in from New York to eat your grilled quail with fig gastrique, while the woman who fired you for being embarrassing has to explain why her dining room is half empty. The full circle moment came one froggy evening when I saw her walk past Bruma. She didn't stop. She didn't come inside. But she slowed down. Looked at the sign. Peeked at the menu posted on the glass. Then she walked away. And I just watched, arms crossed, apron stained, standing in the doorway of the place I built with nothing but hunger and pride. Not out of spite. Not out of hatred. But out of love, for food, for independence, and for the little boy in Casa Verde who was never taken seriously. He was finally more than enough. And this time, no one could take it away.